series on the genetic age. I'm Robert Mittman, and I am going to be the panel moderator and facilitator through the day. I would like to first just begin by acknowledging the sponsors and conveners of this series of panels, and Barbara Jasny from the AAAS and Thane Kreiner from Affymetrix, who both labored mightily to bring these panels about. The series is, as it's entitled, focused on the genetic age, and is going to be looking at the issues in science, the organization and funding of science, the infrastructure, the ethics, the economics of health, and how all of that relates back to the changes that we're seeing in molecular biology and genetics. This first panel I am delighted to welcome here today, and the way that we're going to proceed today is going to be a little bit different from the typical scientific conference scientific presentations. Rather than the series of 4 half-hour PowerPoint presentations, all of that fit into 90 minutes, what we're going to do is have a much more interactive conversational format. I've asked each of the panelists to speak just very briefly to introduce him or herself, and then I've got a series of questions that I would like to launch to them. But very much this also will depend on you in the audience stimulating further comment and conversation. And after we do a couple of introductory rounds of questions, I'll be circulating with wireless handheld mic and inviting your questions and comments to the panel. Let me introduce the panelists first. On your left is Dr. Ann Barker. Ann is at the National Cancer Institute and is the Deputy Director of the Office of Technology and Industrial Relations. She'll introduce herself just a bit more in a moment. To Ann's left is Frank Torti. Frank directs the Cancer Center at Wake Forest University. To Frank's left is Paul Cosenza. Paul is in charge of alliances for PearlGen. If you were paying attention yesterday to the press conference here and to some of the releases in the media, you'll have heard that they were involved in a fairly significant set of papers, and he may be able to comment on that. And then finally, on your far right is Cliff Leaf. Cliff is the executive editor of Fortune magazine. And you might wonder, well, what's the executive editor of Fortune magazine doing here in a conference on the genetic age, and one where we're talking about research? Well, Cliff authored this article. It was last year in Fortune magazine. It was a cover article entitled "Why We're Losing the War on Cancer and How to Win It." Cliff has thought a lot about medical research, cancer research in particular, and so I think is quite well situated to comment here. This initial panel is focused on changing paradigms in science funding and organization. And the premise for this panel is as follows, that with the completion of the mapping of the human genome, with a shift in medical research increasingly towards genetic models, we have to ask the question, if we've had a paradigm shift in the science, is there any necessity for or call for some kind of a shift in the organization and funding of science? Is there some way, are there ways that we would approach it differently to maximize the advantage that we can take of these developments. What we're going to do over the next hour and a quarter is an exploration of that, of looking at the scale of science, the mechanisms by which we fund it, the incentives that scientists face in academic settings, in government settings, in corporate settings, and I hope by the end of the hour and a quarter that we'll come up with a fairly good picture of what sorts of changes we might expect in coming years in the science. Before I launch into questions, what I would like to do is ask each of the panelists to introduce her or himself a little more completely than I was able to do, and at least make some kind of an initial statement to help frame. Well, you know, one of the best statements I've ever heard is that where you stand depends on where you sit, and what I'm hoping is that you can tell us a little bit is where you sit, and maybe you can start for us.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for being here at this early hour and finding the room, actually. So. So where I sit actually is I sit in a role at the National Cancer Institute, which is the largest of the National Institutes of Health in terms of the institutes that are working on these various research questions. Our budget at the National Cancer Institute is about $4.8 billion, which is arguably quite a bit of resource, but cancer, remember, will actually cause the death directly of about 560,000 people this year, and 1.4 million will be diagnosed newly with this disease, and we are looking in the not too distant future of around 40% of the people in this country having cancer. And as you may be aware, around 3 weeks ago, for people under the age of 85 in this country, cancer now exceeds heart disease as the major cause or the major killer. So this is a huge issue for this country and also for the rest of the world. And so it is no surprise that the Congress actually, back in 1971, decided that they would put real resource into this, anticipating, I think, in some ways what was coming. At the National Cancer Institute, my role is to look at broad integrative problems in science and how we can actually fund the kinds of platforms and interfaces that we need to move us. The genetic age, I believe, is on the horizon, maybe across a lake. I haven't decided yet, but we've got some navigation to do here to actually realize the value of this genetic age. There's tons of promise, lots and lots of opportunities. I am trained as a scientist. I'm an immunologist by training, but I've spent my life transitioning from academia through a nonprofit to the business world, where I actually was in the biotechnology sector. Got to found a couple of companies and see how interesting that is and how easy it looks and how difficult it really is to move technology from the laboratory to patients. So overall, just in terms of this topic, I think it's a very intriguing topic, and I think we'll have a nice conversation today, because I think we are at a point where there are lots of choices to make. The choices will be, I think, very, very important, and I think we're going to have to do some prioritization to make the right choices. And I think the issue is going to be how we balance our portfolio to maximize our return. So I'll say more about that, Robert, later.
Good. Frank?
So I'm a medical oncologist by training. I see patients with primarily genitourinary cancers, so it gives me an opportunity every week to meet with some nice people who are my patients. I run a lab, have for many years, have an R01. I guess that's one of the reasons I'm here, have a merit award from the NIH. So that gives me an opportunity to meet some really smart people. And then I head the Cancer Center in the Department of Cancer Biology at Wake Forest, so I have to deal with a variety of hospital and medical administrators, and so I do meet those people as well, and I'll leave the descriptors of that group to you. So that's what I do. I guess in some ways where I sit is I don't sit enough, but it's an interesting mix of jobs.
Good. Thanks, Frank. Paul?
And I work with Perligen Sciences. Perligen was actually spun out of Affymetrix 4 years ago as an independent company. And what we do is we do genomics and genetics research, doing high-density whole genome genetic studies to determine the genetic basis of disease or differential drug response. And so I oversee all of the alliances for Perlogen. We work with 6 of the top 10 pharmas, for example, and we do collaborations with them. I also work on the public sector side, and we actually do collaborations with the government, with foundations, working with academics, et cetera. And in terms of then funding, there's a variety of sources you can get funding from for scientific research. So one is you can actually do some funding yourself, because something may be very important. And so an example of that is what was alluded to earlier, is that if you get today's issue of Science, you'll see that the cover article actually is research that we recently just released and made public, which is where we did 1.6 million SNPs and 71 individuals from a variety of geographic areas of the world, essentially, although they were all Americans, but from ancestry that was broad. And then by looking at this, then we could actually build a haplotype map and look at the LD bins, et cetera. We did this research as a useful tool to us to help inform what we do in our genetic research and these association studies I'm talking about. It's all about trying to help people, so it's all about doing, let's find the genetic basis of the disease and the differential drug response, but we need tools to do that. This is one we also made public, so we can talk more about that later if we want. So you can fund things yourselves, and this one we did because we had to do it fast and quickly, so we chose to do it on our own dollar. We also, though, get government funding, and we do grants, and so, for example, we've got a grant with well, actually 8 of the NIH institutes, including the National Cancer Institute. And, for example, like in Alzheimer's disease, we're doing a whole genome association study funded by the National Institute on Aging. NHGRI, or the Human Genome Research Institute, we're doing a project with the International Hat Map. So they wanted to get a higher density of SNPs there. So we originally, were awarded a grant to do basically 600 million genotypes. And when the community sort of looked at that, and this was funded by NHGRI, it was like, gee, this is really an opportunity let's do the whole SNP catalog, essentially, of what's available. Let's do over 4 million SNPs, 4.6 million SNPs, and actually these 270 samples, because we'll actually have a much better complete answer. And so in that case, NHGRI then put in additional money, Perlogen put in money. We also got people like the Wellcome Trust to invest in it, Genome Canada, Genome Quebec, and also commercial entities like Bristol Myers Squibb and Pfizer, who also contributed. So it's, again, science funding coming from a variety of entities, both government and commercial. So there's government funding. On the other hand, you can also then work with foundations. So for example, we are doing a study on Parkinson's disease, collaborating with the Mayo Clinic on that, and the funding is coming from the Michael J. Fox Foundation. So again, this is something that they want to do breakthrough funding to move quickly, to try and get an answer sooner, and so their thought was, look, we're going to do some, the LEAP program, let's fund these kind of efforts. So that's another source of funding. Again, we're just looking for ways to how we can get the work done sooner, because every day you do the research sooner, it's just that much quicker that hopefully we can get solutions for people. And then another example is just a couple days ago we announced one in breast cancer research that we're doing with Cambridge University as our collaborator. And that was funded by Cancer Research UK, which is a large funder of cancer research in the United Kingdom. So again, looking at global sources. So there's government, there's foundations, and then the last one I'll just sort of mention is then you can also go to industry. And for example, we're doing a study of metabolic syndrome, and again, that's funded by Pfizer. So we went to Pfizer for that. So there's a variety of sources to get scientific funding. We can talk more about those issues as we get into the discussion.
Great, thanks, Paul. Cliff?
Well, I'm Cliff Leaf, and as Robert mentioned, I'm executive editor at Fortune magazine. And again, I can't stress enough how important it is that I'm not a scientist for this discussion. I am so not a scientist that the last science I tried to learn was in college studying glacial geology. I thought that was the easiest thing to get out of my Division III credit, or my requirement, and I had to withdraw that failing. So I think that what I do at Fortune is relevant to this discussion, because what I do is study systems, and I study cultures, and we look at businesses, and we look at government, and we look at enterprises of every shape and form. And we see what works and what doesn't work, and so we do our best to analyze it from any number of angles and any number of constituents. And so when I began looking at the enterprise of cancer research last year, I was surprised by what I saw as a failure of the culture, and that's what I wrote about in depth, as some of the people here have read. And that has caused a conversation, a rather large conversation, in a scope that surprised me. But it's a welcoming conversation because I think a lot of people have looked in to see what works and what doesn't, and how can we make things better. So I just want to finish up with Robert's point about from where you sit is really the vantage point. And I actually think science works. Here's a shocker for some people who know me. What I don't think works necessarily is our pace in cancer research. And I think it comes back to what Ann said before about the only reason that you would question where we are here is if you're not happy with the pace of the progress. If there's some reason why we have to hurry a little faster than we are, and how the environment is changing and why we need to change the rules perhaps. So I want to get back to what Ann talked about in some of the statistics. If you picture how many people dying in a single day, it's like 3 jumbo jet airlines packed to the gills, crashing in a fiery blaze every day. Okay? That's the number of people dying from cancer. When I started writing my piece, cancer was not the #1 killer of Americans under age 85. It now is. And so I think we have to keep that in perspective, because what we have here is not only a crisis of human proportions, but one of financial proportions that are extraordinary, and will make the Social Security crisis, if there is one, look like chump change. So that's why I'm here.
Well, Cliff, I'd actually like to bounce off of what you just said and come back to what Ann said. And if I could kind of put those two comments together, what I would say is that increasingly our scientific research, our researchers, our national research enterprise is being pushed to have some higher return on our investment in it. Higher and faster return on our investment. And you mentioned the word portfolio, which has a fairly financial kind of connotation. But as we look across the broad scientific enterprise, I guess my question is, what's the right portfolio? If we've got a portfolio, if our investment, our national investment, is some mix of infrastructure and technology and basic research and translational research and development, I guess my first question to all of you is, do we have that mix about right? And if not, what can we do to improve the mix? What can we do to improve the mix in that portfolio? Ann?
So maybe I could start. I think we have to sort of understand where we are. And understanding where you are is always difficult, because when you're sort of draining the swamp, you don't quite see the alligators. So, and part of what I do is to try to figure out, sort of how to move us out of the swamp. So there's what we don't know about. We're talking about cancer, but I think a lot of what we're saying could apply across any of these disease areas where it's, whether it involves, Alzheimer's or AIDS. I could argue that some of the issues are exactly the same, probably totally overlapping, and will be solved by some of the same means. So there's what we don't know about cancer, and there's what we do know. And it's very interesting. We know a lot, and we don't know a lot. And we have to actually consider both of those issues as we go forward. And I would argue that that's what really drives your portfolio balance. Now, if you look at the National Cancer Act, as an example, was passed in 1971. So it's been approximately 34 years. We've spent a fair amount of money. I would argue not enough. Most people would argue not enough, but because the size of the problem that Cliff talked about. But it's a lot, and we know a lot. And during that period of time, we have focused pretty heavily on the investigative pieces of this. And we've learned a great deal about cancer, and in doing that, we've learned a lot about a lot of other diseases. Especially, we've pushed the genetics issues, and I would argue that cancer has really allowed us to underpin the sequencing of the genome, as an example. We wouldn't have been able to ask a lot of those questions had we not invested. Having said that, harnessing what we do know is a challenge. If we had known in '71 how difficult this was going to be, we would have built our infrastructure somewhat differently. We don't have the infrastructure in this country to translate what we know very well. And we can talk more about this, I think, but if I just step back and say, how do we get across this lake to realize the value of all this promise we have for all of you to have personalized medicine in the future? You go in with your smart card, people know all of your genetic aberrations, and they can actually personally treat you for cancer or whatever your diseases are. Is going to take some change in thinking. And so back to this portfolio idea, this community is not connected, has to be connected, has to be in real time able to share information. And the driver of everything we're talking about here is information. So we've got to be able to share information. We've got to use a common language. We've got to work off common technology platforms. And everybody has to have access to those advanced technologies and be able to use them in real time. And that is virtually missing right now from the equation. And I think we can talk about how we balance and maintain the capacity to find out what we don't know and capitalize on what we do know.
Good, thanks. I'd like to come back to some of those infrastructure questions in a little bit. But Cliff, you're a systems guy. What's your take on the portfolio question?
Well, I was just thinking about this as Ann was talking and as you raised the question. And there's a difference between important and relevant. And I think that really speaks to a lot of what our discussion is going to turn on. I would say that everybody in this room values your own work, and I would say lots of people around you value your work as well. What you do is important, and I would say that what I do is important, and I would hope that my colleagues would agree. The question is whether it's relevant, and the way you understand whether something's relevant, is by looking at the ultimate goal and looking at the culture. It's cultures that define relevance. And so I think in a community of basic scientists, every bit of basic science is relevant, okay? In a community of translational scientists, every bit of translational science is relevant. So how do you determine what the culture, what the community that matters is for, say, let's just take cancer, since that's one thing that I have some sense about here. And I think that's really where the challenge is. And I would argue that what's necessary is some common language between all of these communities, some infrastructure, so that you can gather and talk about what's relevant and what isn't. Now, believe it or not, we don't have that. I want to throw out one quick analogy. Every Thanksgiving, my in-laws get together and they do these jigsaw puzzles, and they're 10,000 pieces or whatever they are. They're horrible, and it's a contact sport with these guys play. I hate it. I mean, I can't emphasize how much I hate it. But at the end of these long weekends, they somehow get these puzzles done. Because they all sit around the table and they all look at the picture, and there is a picture on the box, and so they get some sense. It's usually murky, but they can figure it out. I liken cancer research and the whole cancer community to researchers studying their own jigsaw piece and then taking it off to their room. You can never complete the puzzle. You don't even have a sense of what this puzzle should look like if you're going to take the piece off to your room. So that's where I believe we are. And I'd love to talk more about that. And I think Ann has raised some very key issues about how to solve that.
So Frank, are you taking your puzzle piece off to your room with your R01U and your colleagues at Wake Forest, or is there a broader, kind of a broader scheme to establish the relevance of the research that you do in the broader context that Cliff alluded to?
Well, I'm not going to answer that. But let me step back and talk about the portfolio, or my perceptions of portfolios and when to change them. And I think you just don't change them willy-nilly. You change them at moments where you think something in the environment is changing, so you have to change your portfolio. And I do think this is actually a pivotal time in cancer science and in biological science. And I'm not sure it's actually recognized for that. Pivotal now, not pivotal 5 years ago, not pivotal 2 years from now, in the sense that, and I just do this by anecdote. So 2 days ago, we had a major drug company come and show us their drugs and their portfolio of new drugs. And we looked at pathways and their targets in those pathways. Those pathways didn't exist 5 years ago, and those targets could not have existed 5 years ago. And I think with the completion of the sequencing of the human genome, but more important, in understanding some of the signaling pathways by which cancer cells grow and spread, we are at a moment that is very different. There's sort of a paradigm shift from where we were 5 years ago and 20 years ago. So that now we do actually have an opportunity to change the portfolio somewhat, to do more translational and focused research, because we've been so enormously successful and perhaps even efficient in some ways at defining those first steps. So I stop there. Yeah, maybe it is a time to change the portfolio. I think this is a critical moment to understand that this is a moment where things have changed, where we need to look at how they've changed.
Paul?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting is there's this question of the portfolio, and the question I guess I have is, well, who's managing the portfolio? If it's a company, it's very easy, right? You can sort of decide what's going to happen. But here it's a community. So what does that mean then? It means that individuals have to take it upon themselves to be leaders and to increase communication with others. And so events like this is fantastic because it's talking about these issues. Through communication and individual leadership, people can make things happen. But it does take people to do that, to say, well, let's get these folks together so we can cooperate and make it happen. And it's a tough problem because it's a global group that's really looking at these issues, and there's lots of different parties there. And so it's not just, the US government, there's also the European governments, et cetera. There's a lot of forums for these discussions. As I look at it too, there's also this balance beam aspect to it, which is cooperation, I think, is very much needed because a lot of inefficiencies exist because people are replicating and doing the same things in small levels, et cetera, whereas if they just combined it together, you could get it done better and much more efficiently. Examples are like the HapMap effort, which is where people came together, people taking leadership to make that happen. In some respects, though, I understand that there's value to this letting new ideas happen and having a competitiveness element too, because some people, if you had like one person deciding, they may say, well, don't go do this idea, right? And without that, you may stifle something that's actually a very important breakthrough research. So you have to permit that to happen. And with a sense of competitiveness then, maybe that'll help us to get, from a pace question, answers sooner. So there's a variety of, it's a tough problem, obviously, but I think it begins with individuals sort of asking these questions, looking inside, and increasing communication, and then taking your individual leadership to see how you can, through persuasion, have people do the right things. And there's great forums for that, like the National Cancer Institute, et cetera.
So let me just comment. I think you're absolutely right. This isn't an NCI problem or a Fortune problem or even a Wake Forest problem. It's all of our problem. And again, what we've not done is actually built the sort of ways that we would have that dialogue. And a very interesting shift has occurred, I think, as recently as the last 3 years, where so much of what we are going to be doing in the future is going to depend on what patients decide could be done. Because as we move into the genetic age, actually the materials, they're going to drive genetics and they're going to drive proteomics, and these biomarkers are going to actually inform the kind of thing that Dr. Torti's talking about in terms of new drugs. It's going to be what patients decide that they're going to enable researchers with, which are the materials that you carry around with you, your tissues, your blood, what have you. So the other thing I would say is that this inflection point, or this point that we're at, which is, everybody feels it, nobody can quite yet define it, but we are still moving at glacial speed. We really are moving very slow in an era when we need to move very fast. And just this idea of drug development is a good example. If you look at our pharma companies, and we're fortunate we can see all the drugs that are coming through with the NCI. We sort of know what everybody's doing. We're in a position, and I chair the FDA NCI task force, so I see all the new drugs coming into FDA. And this community blames FDA for virtually everything, and very little is really their fault, because basically we don't have the science in place to support the endpoints that we would like. But I'm intrigued by the fact that we have to be very, very careful at this point that we don't go down some paths that don't take us where we need to be. And I think we need to think very bold at this point to really put together some answers that will take us further in areas of advanced technology that we haven't really sort of brought into our thinking.
Well, I hear an interesting tension in what the two of you have just said, though, which is on the one hand, what I'm hearing is we've got to place some bigger bets. We've got to encourage collaborations, for instance, with the HAP map that presumably, assuming no new resources or not a lot of new resources are flowing into the system, that would displace some amount of more investor-initiated research and give us sort of a different risk profile. But then what I've just heard you say, Ann, is that, well, we've got to place the bets, but we got to be right in order to make sure that those resources are well expended, that the return on that investment is good in our portfolio.
But deliberating so long that we don't make decisions is unacceptable.
Yeah.
Right.
I just want to touch on Ann's point here, and which I think is really very, very smart and perfectly timed to the discussion. We talk about return of investment. We talk about that we're close now. And I think Dr. Cordy is right, that there has been a shift in science, at least from my pathetic vantage point where I can see it even. But I have to tell you that I've also been an historian in the cancer war. And I've been studying this, what we've been saying for a long, long time. And I can tell you, I'll throw out some numbers. Back at the end of 2002, we had published as a group 1.6 million scientific papers on cancer. Okay, 1.6 million. We had tried countless hundreds of thousands of compounds that had been directed towards at least targets that were informed by this basic science. Out of a period of 12 years or 13 years, from January 1990 to the end of 2002, there were 71 cancer drugs approved by the FDA. Out of those, 3/4 of them did not improve the lifespan of the patients taking them. They did not improve survival. That's not what they did. So 3/4 of the 71 drugs that were approved, 75%, that were tested over gosh knows how many years, often at a cost of $1 billion. I mean, $1 million. Wait, no, $800 million. $1 billion, excuse me. We're supposed to know that at Fortune. Still did not do the job. And so the question is, when people were talking about how the discovery of oncogenes were going to change things, and so much of what we've seen, we're still at a place where we are moving at a glacial progress. And we can talk about the fact that we're on the cusp of something great, and I agree we are. But if the systems aren't in place to change things, then we always be just always one step behind. And that's really the question.
So in some senses, the hypothesis is, and I don't disagree with it, but I think it's worth challenging at least, is that, had we taken that money and had we had more direction, had we had more focus, had we had more leadership, that investment would be better spent. But, but is the wrong word. If we look at the test of that hypothesis, or at least one test of it, you say, well, where was there real focus in drug development? And for every dollar that the government has invested in cancer research, as you pointed out, there's been 1.5 that pharma has invested in research as well. So there is focus, clearly. There is leadership. There's not a bunch of individual R01 entrepreneurs. And yet the same criticism that can be made of the public sector, okay, that is that millions of dollars have been spent on it, has also produced very little in the way of cancer drugs. So that the alternative argument based on the same data, and in fact the motivation, just the motivation in this country, short of a Mayan football game, the motivation that is to make money at the end of the day drives things with great focus. So here you have a large pharma. They've got their end in mind. They're going to make more money. You tell them how to do it. Go and get drugs for cancer. You're going to make a fortune. And yet they failed. And so my question is that, or my alternative hypothesis to the observation is that maybe it is not entirely a lack of leadership, a lack of focus, but a lack of those fundamental tools, a lack of knowing what the pathways are. I think for the last 30 years, we've been trying to put a facet in a diamond with a sledgehammer, and it doesn't work, and no matter how much leadership you put to it. But now we do have a roadmap, a genetic roadmap, and a sort of biological roadmap. So then the question comes, going forward, is the issue more leadership, or is the issue that now we have the targets and there'll be a natural acceleration of the product because we have the targets? So that's my question.
I just want to answer one quick thing and then I'll... but I would agree that I don't think that big pharma or little pharma has done any better in this issue than public pharma, publicly funded pharma. But I don't really think that is the issue. I don't think that focus comes from, this is a Fortune magazine editor, from a private enterprise necessarily. And I can tell you that I think what I'm looking at is something which is a creative, entrepreneurial, very decentralized enterprise. In fact, so decentralized you might call it diasporic, or whatever the word is, a diaspora-like enterprise. And yet it's non-uniform, it's aspirational, pragmatic, cynical, skeptical. Are those good words to describe science? I think they probably are. You could use those same descriptives to talk about what I do, journalism. We are a creative, entrepreneurial enterprise. We're skeptical, sometimes too skeptical. We are aspirational. We are non-uniform. We are decentralized, and to the point of diaspora. And yet, somehow, you've taken my little microcosm, which is where stories can take, where journalists can take anywhere from 2 days to a year on a story. So on a scale, at least, it's comparable to science, where nobody is really told what to do and what to look for. And somehow, every 2 weeks, we get out a magazine with 30 to 50 stories in it, and we've been doing it every year for 75 years. So how does that happen? What are the elements? Well, the only thing I would say that's different between this particular enterprise and science is common language, a common infrastructure, and that doesn't mean there aren't dialects, but a system for communicating a common goal. Those are the three things. And so I think that if we can get that in science, whether it's in public science or private science, but coordinate that, that's where I think we'll be more effective. And I think this discussion really is about what the role of funding is and the ways we do that and the incentives. And so I think that all has to come, what is the role of government here? What is the role of the NCI and the NIH? Should it be providing a common infrastructure? Should it be providing a common language? Should it be providing a common goal? Or should it be funding individual basic science? And that's really, I think, one of the questions. I would argue the former.
I guess I would add the other thing that journalists have that scientists don't yet is a deadline.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful motivator. Paul, you were trying to get in.
Yeah, and first of all, I'd say that I think the role is both, right? It's both the communication and the coordination and the funding. And I think what Frank was saying was very important too. You do have to have the right tools so you can prioritize your research and to be more effective. And if you don't have the right tools to make it happen, you do what's best available, right? And then as things move forward, better tools become available, and we know a lot more about genetics today than we did 10 years ago or 5 years ago. We're going to know a lot more 5 years from now. And it's part of a journey, and it's about getting that right information and focusing on it. I think the other thing is that, again, as you mentioned, there's this tension. And this tension is this aspect of, well, do you do the big cooperative items, or do you also fund the smaller entrepreneurial efforts? And I think the right answer is you got to do some of both. And it's about managing that tension. It's that balance beam concept. If you have an investment portfolio, right? And if you're investing in stocks or bonds, et cetera, again, you're trying to manage risk of trying to get to a certain goal or endpoint, and you have to do a bit of both. Because if you put all of your eggs in just one stock, right, Enron, that would not be a good thing, right? Because you can't have all that one package or that one effort. You have to do some of those for the research. But then you also have to support some of these smaller entrepreneurial new ideas, which often represent the breakthrough. And the idea is then, well, how do you then divide that portfolio? And so NCI and others, sit down and say, well, for our research budget, here's what we're going to do. So let's do some of these where we get more to cooperate and tackle these big issues, maybe do some bigger projects. Maybe we'll be more flexible and as we sort of look at different grants as they sort of come through, et cetera, in terms of which ones to fund to what degree. But I think it is an aspect of managing that tension. And we'll all have different ways about how we'll do it. And that's the dilemma. And that's why people like Fortune are so important, because putting the communication out there so the public voice can be heard, people can discuss these issues, that may help shape how we all think about these issues and then make those decisions.
Let me ask you each to put on a forecaster hat for a second and ask if you had to place bets on the next 5 years on the mix in that portfolio, the share that's going to be going towards the larger collaborative multi-institution kinds of studies. Do you think that share will increase or decrease in the portfolio in the coming 5 years?
Well, I mean, in terms of what we've been seeing is that, this is, and, to use a derogatory term, the buzzword, the translational group managed kinds of science, things like the SPORE grants, the specialized programs of regional excellence, where cancer centers get entrusted with a lot of money and they are then there's this notion of collaboration is imposed upon them, and they've got to do lots of different things. Some people love it, some people hate it. I would guess that there would be more of that, and probably you're going to get hit a little bit in the R01 budget. But I think that, again, the issue really, for me, isn't so much whether big science is better than little science, but whether the issue to me is still having that common language, and whether scientists everywhere can communicate in a way that is truly comprehensible. I don't think we do that. I mean, I don't think scientists do that.
Yeah.
So that's really where I think the question lies.
I think it'll likely increase. I think that there is more communication, and then we'll hit these issues. And what's good about hitting some issues, they can help them prioritize answers, right? If you say, you go forward 5 years from now, gosh, I certainly hope we have a better understanding of the genetic basis of a lot of these diseases, right? But finding that genetic basis can be very useful, maybe to have a diagnostic that's predictive to help prevent the disease from even appearing, which is what you really ultimately want to do, as you've so well wrote. But I think the other piece with that is that then a lot of research has to happen afterwards, but how do you translate it into new treatments or new solutions or how to prevent it? And so I believe we'll have more cooperation, we'll have more information, and we'll have more of those bigger efforts. But I hope we still don't lose some of those smaller ones, because that'll create great new ideas.
Well, it would become an unbalanced portfolio if it went overboard in that direction. Frank?
Well, I think we desperately need a common language, and we desperately need the appropriate platforms to do science, whether it's large scale or small scale. And so I think the answer is there's going to have to be that investment of infrastructure that's really important, and we're not going to do well without that. But I want to turn, the issue. But the other thing that we need is we need the best people going into science to ask and answer these questions, because these platforms will only be successful to the extent we can make an attractive environment for science, for careers, for people to actually tackle these problems. And I'm not sure we're doing that now. And so I mean, the answer to the portfolio issue, I think, is absolutely clear. We need more investments there, and there's going to be some pain in that, but it's absolutely necessary. And we need more focus, and I agree with that. But the real issue for me is that's all the parts that are defined by infrastructure and leadership. Those are important. But unless we have really top-notch people, and I'm just practical about this. I mean, smart people have a choice. They're going to go and get a PhD, and cure cancer, they're going to go get an MBA and do something else. And how do we attract them? And I think we're losing them. So.
Ann?
Yes, so let me just take the conversation up just a level to around 40,000 feet. So what we're talking about, and I want to come back to, is information. Okay, everything that we're talking about in healthcare is going to be driven now by information. We talk about the human genome. You know, we basically now have a 4-letter digital code that's going to drive what we know about disease. So we have to start thinking differently about this issue. And Paul talked about SNPs. Well, I mean, basically SNPs are, for those of you that don't know, are single nucleotide polymorphisms. That may mean nothing to you, but that means that in your germline, or in those cells that actually are responsible for reproduction, if you have a genetic defect, it'll get picked up that way. So we'll use those SNPs to actually characterize what your risk is to disease over time. But the thing I'm struck with is that everybody's right. You know, we need a portfolio, but we don't have a systems-oriented portfolio. There's discovery, and I'm pretty comfortable with discovery right now. I'll be honest with you. I don't know if we're funding too little or too much, but we're funding a lot. At the NCI, our nearly $5 billion budget, a little over 50% of that is in what we're talking about here is individual-initiated research. So there's discovery, there's development. This whole big morass we call development is getting it out of the lab, figuring out if you have proof of concept, if it's going to be, you know, if it's a viable potential commercial idea, which is not very well figured out at all. And then you've got the regulatory phase of this, whether you're making a diagnostic or therapeutic or what have you. Then you've got to go over and convince the regulators that it's safe, which is a conversation that's going on in spades this week about some of the drugs that we're interested in, and efficacious. Is it better than something else that's on the market already? So what we've not done, I think, in any of, except for AIDS, which I think they've done a pretty good job actually of putting the system together, I don't think we've done a good job in any of these chronic, large impact diseases, especially cancer, in putting that systems together. So I want to agree with Frank that we need better people, we need more people, but I think we need different people. And I think coming into this field, we're going to need more mathematicians, more engineers. I want to see astronomers thinking about these problems because they deal with large systems issues. And our folks are not thinking that way, as to your point and to Cliff's point, they do have a piece, and sometimes it's a pretty small piece, maybe an important piece, hopefully. The one thing, though, that I think we've got to think long and hard about is what I call the Sutter's Mill phenomenon. And you all know what happened at Sutter's Mill. They discovered gold. And in science, we are a little bit Sutter's Mill-like. Somebody finds something. You know, we find out that, gosh, blood vessels growing into tumors is pretty important. And we call that area angiogenesis. Well, a lot of our researchers will sort of run over to that side of the ship because it looks pretty interesting. So, you know, once something looks pretty interesting, like we had a drug approved a few years ago called Gleevec, which is this targeted agent for chronic myelogenous leukemia. There was a lot of assumptions at that point that this was going to be easy. You know, that these molecular defects were going to actually just be out there and we were going to make, you know, thousands of these targeted drugs. So we had lots of people sort of run off without enough discovery being done actually to do this. And I think the only way we're going to empower the solution to some of these questions is to have people investigate in ways that doesn't necessarily send them, you know, and so we don't have as much duplication in the portfolio as we have now, and that we deal with these interfaces and that we actually put the infrastructure in place to take the discoveries, put them into development, and actually have enough science to get them into the marketplace. So it's a systems problem, coming back to Cliff's point, which we right now don't seem to have a handle on how to solve.
Let me link a couple of your comments together and ask you a question of how we proceed on making some of the changes that are implied in this. I guess the first message that I'm getting is that we will be working increasingly in partnerships. And Paul, you mentioned some of the ones that PearlGen is involved in that involve everything from government funders and researchers, industry, foundations, academics, so really quite broad-based collaborations. And I think there are other scientific disciplines than genetic research where that's very much a habit. I mean, if you look at most physics papers, the list of authors is as long as your arm. Very few medical papers have author lists like that. And so, first question, why? What does it take to get multiple parties involved? The second is to Ann's point about getting people from different disciplines, from widely different disciplines involved in this kind of research. What does it take to do that? Frank, I know at Wake Forest have been quite effective in bringing physicists and nanotechnologists into cancer research, mathematical biologists into cancer research. How do you go about that, and what kinds of mechanisms work there to interest them?
There are always more than one, and I'm not sure I'm particularly facile at that. But it impresses me that people who are in the fields, in the cancer research field, and those people who are interested in these other fields, mathematicians, physicists, et cetera, are really compelled by the excitement at these interfaces. I mean, you can say, well, it's driven by now there's an RFA about this or that, but I don't think it entirely is. And I think there is nothing more exciting and energizing than to get people in different disciplines together, because it is so much fun and it is so hard and for them to understand each other. But then when they do, something really neat comes out of that. And I just give you an example from something we've done recently, which was trying to work through with people at the Virginia Bioinformatics Institute, who a group of mathematicians looking at systems biology from mathematical approaches, and a group of cancer biologists in the Cancer Center at Wake, and looking very specifically at a very limited signaling pathway in breast cancer and in breast tissues, an oxidative stress pathway, and trying to actually model that, with the idea being that you would actually define very carefully the steady state of these proteins and small molecules in the cell, and then perturb that and model that perturbation so you could predict a second oxidant perturbation. Sounds simple. Sounds like something you could have a meeting and just sort of decide you were going to do. And it turned out that it took 5 or 6 meetings between the two groups just to understand what the mathematicians needed in terms of experimental design in order to design an experiment that was, and simply they needed more time points than you could imagine in order to make a mathematical model in terms of experimental modulation. Well, we didn't understand that, and we didn't understand why they needed that, and we didn't understand the mathematics behind that. But eventually, when we did, some nice things have come out of that, and people, travel the hour and a half. I mean, they're excited to meet, and so I think you have to play to the real motivations of smart people. If they are excited about what they're doing, great things come out of that. And one has to be a little bit careful about, I love the business metaphors, but I also get nervous about the business metaphors, because those return on investment metaphors, I see a lot of companies that make decisions by the quarter base and not beyond the quarter or the year, because that's how business is driven, and yet that's very different from what we're trying to do here in some ways. So that has to be balanced. I think there's that excitement to bringing people together. I think that's what we ought to be doing. I totally agree with Ann that it's bringing these groups to bear on these biological issues that will drive the next step. So we need not only good biological scientists, but good mathematical scientists. We need to get them engaged, but we're going to get them engaged, I think, by offering them sort of the intellectual excitement of working in a group that really is exciting, that is fundamentally exciting. Short of that, it's not going to work.
I think this gets right to the heart of the matter, which is, I mean, you mentioned bringing people in. I do the hiring for our magazine, and we get a lot of young people come in, and I say you're going to be incredibly overworked and underpaid, and they say, when can I start? I think that it is about wanting to be somewhere where it works, where it's fun, where you're intellectually challenged, where you feel like you're doing some good. And I think that the reason why we don't have more young scientists entering MD, PhD programs or trying to work in translational environments or getting excited and choosing this career has more to do with the systems that are in place, the barriers and disincentives that are in place. Let's talk about things like, the countless review boards, the funding process by which they have to go try to get an RON grant. I mean, it's countless years of your life. It's a multi-stage process in which you go through, gathering your data for a year and then submitting it for another year for a committee, a study section that could have mercurial interest, and you might or may not get to that point of funding where you have to start all over again. You've got to deal with HIPAA rules and tons of other regulations, external review boards, your own university or drug company or cancer center's requirements. You've got the pressure to publish all the time. I mean, these are the kinds of things that discourage great young minds from wanting to go into it. And why, when we talk about the business model, I agree, the quarter-to-quarter thinking is dangerous. It's dangerous for business. It's dangerous for, as we've seen and we've written about in our magazine. But after 130 some odd quarters since the war on cancer began, people have a right to ask about return on investment. After 130 some odd quarters, if you were holding Walmart stock or IBM or one of the great companies, P&G, you'd have a right to expect some sort of return on investment. So I think that's where we are. I don't think that the question about return on investment is inherently impatient. I think, so again, how do you get those incentives right? If you look at the NIH, and I encourage all of you to do this, is to go down into the funding mechanisms. It takes a while to navigate on their site. But there are 111 alphanumeric codes like R01, 111. Out of those, 91, I think, were funded by the NIH, by institutes of the NIH, or 22 or something, in the last year. So when you think about what it would take to navigate that system in terms of getting your funding, it just boggles the mind. I mean, I know these are the kinds of issues that Ann struggles with every day, trying to make them coordinated. But this is the world of science. You've got drug companies having their rules about what they're trying. They've got problems accruing clinical trials. You've got almost no participation in clinical trials from adults, at least in the oncology space. Why? Why? Because there's no incentive for them to go. And these are the things you've got to deal with, the problems in the culture, and some of that is money. Some of it is pressures of publishing. Some of it is all the regulation and the rules. Some of it is a lack of ability to communicate.
I'd like to come back to that ability to communicate and some of the infrastructures for that communication. And Ann, you mentioned this earlier in this conversation that we don't have the infrastructures in place, or in some cases, if we do have the infrastructures in place, they're not really that well used. They're not widely adopted. And it reminds me of the old saw. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't necessarily make that horse drink. And if I look across actually all of healthcare, and including to some extent healthcare research, there seems to be quite an addiction to not invented here, to my own information bioinformatics platform, my own tissue repository that I control. And yet it seems to me like there potentially is a role for broader infrastructures. I know that the National Cancer Institute has an initiative, the Cancer Bioinformatics Grid, that could be that sort of a common research infrastructure for cancer research. That there's been work done at the NCI and across other organizations that is well developed in other countries for creating a national biospecimen network where the infrastructure, the processes and standards for consenting and annotating and processing biospecimens would be common. Why isn't that further developed and better adopted than it is now, Ann?
So let me just comment just for 1 second though on the reward system. We talk incessantly at the National Institutes of Health about the reward system and why we don't have the right reward system. Well, I would argue that that's probably a moot conversation. I mean, I think actually people are rewarded pretty well. I mean, honestly, most researchers who are well funded aren't suffering. I mean, I think it's not the kind of lifestyle where you're out there competing day to day in terms of what ditch you're going to dig today. It's not a bad life. I mean, let's be clear. You got to do a lot of very exciting things. As we try to move to team science, I think it's going to be less about how you pay people. I think it's be more about how we recognize what people do. And I think the system will shift. I mean, I think, the whole issue of how much you publish is I think, going to change. Because frankly, I have a grandson who knows as much genomics as people would have known 10 years ago in the population. And I think that particular generation coming along is going to change everything. I mean, I don't think we really have as many worries about good people coming to the system as we think, because they understand digital code as we don't. So I'm not as concerned about the reward structure, but I think the NIH has to take the lead to do something. I don't think the academic medical centers are going to change this, particularly on their own, because many of them are actually very much driven by what the federal government is funding in these centers. So I think we have to work with the community to change that. Coming back to the issue that you're raising in terms of the connectivity of the community, the one thing that troubles me is that if Andy Grove, the founder of Intel, a friend of mine, talks about information turns. What is that? Well, in the chip world, and I'm sure that Affymetrix could speak to this as well, you gauge information almost in real time. Information occurs and is published or out there, whatever mechanism the community uses, almost in real time. And you have to know to be able to make sure that you are not so far behind the curve that you're going to be out of business. In our world, and this is the biomedical research world, you do the work, you write the paper, and you publish it. And sometimes in that interim, you present it. That can take a year. That can take 18 months for a piece of information. I'm telling you, it would be easier for Pony Express mail to reach people. And we still are working in that particular venue, and we're still working that way. And we all sit at computers. So this is going to change. I mean, that, and you mentioned the Cancer Bioinformatics Grid. This is something that the NCI is doing to connect our community. So we have 44 of our cancer centers now, by choice, and under contract money that we're supplying, being able to work in an open source way to share all the data they're creating in real time. Now that may sound perfectly normal to you, but frankly, these villages are quite different. And many of our investigators are making their own water and generating their own electricity and printing their own books. I mean, it's that self-contained. So I think the issue is the nature of the culture, coming back to Cliff's point, in terms of we have depended so heavily on the individual innovator, and now that individual innovator has to be tied so closely to every other innovator, and we didn't really plan on that. So I think this issue of connectivity and the transfer in real time of information is going to be the thing that's going to drive this field. And because frankly, we didn't get into this, but the complexity of these systems, don't underestimate it. We're going to make progress. We're going to make a lot of progress. But frankly, the systems are so redundant and so smart. Look at AIDS. Look at what we're facing now, and look how much success we had. These cells are, These cells are built with redundancy that we can only imagine. And however, it doesn't mean that we can't move in front of that. For example, for cancer, if we can just get biomarkers in place that define this disease, we can diagnose it early enough to actually cut it off. No pun intended. The surgeons will find a new life here, though. So I think it's the connectivity issue. I really think it's the common informatics platforms and the information turns increasing.
Well, let me come back to the original old saw. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. Can you make them drink? You know, you said the 43 cancer centers are participating voluntarily.
The story, this was a new day. We basically said, if you want the money to do this, you got to play by the rules. And that means that you have to adopt the infrastructure. You have to put your data in real time. You have to share. You can't copyright the stuff that you have. You know, you got to put it up online. Now, there were lots of conversations around that because that's not the way that people have normally behaved. So the answer is yes. People do recognize the value of this, and yes, at the end of the day, 44 of our cancer centers signed up and are online. So you can lead a horse to water, and you know, basically sometimes they may not like the way the water is configured, but they're if they're thirsty, I have a feeling they're gonna participate.
They'll drink.
I mean, what we saw, I mean, in the development of, if you talk about great science and engineering in Silicon Valley, and this notion that you could create a Semitech, you could create a common understanding, not an organization, but an understanding. I mean, if you look at 4 of the best letters together, you know, are not the nucleotides, but it's HTML. It's the language of the internet that has connected. I mean, think about that. Think about how those 4 letters have connected everybody. And science could not be done today without HTML.
Right.
How many of you do Google searches now to find the papers that we're talking about anyway, these scientific papers? So that's what we need. We need that HTML. And when you point it out to scientists, talking about getting them to work together, you say, here is the common goal. Who doesn't want this? You say, okay, as excited as you are by the next tyrosine kinase signal transduction pathway, wow, that's exciting to map that. Think about an HTML, a Google, an ability to search with Google for everything you particularly are interested in Des Moines that is going to be available in Bad Springe, Germany. You know, that sort of connectivity, instant. And so I think we have to think in terms of pushing science towards this Semitech. I mean, Andy Grove is also a friend of mine, has a great saying. I mean, this is, you know, no slouch when it comes to engineering and science. You know, says that if cancer researchers were our first boat builders, they'd still be studying water flow dynamics. You know, you have to, at some point, you know, create common systems and float some boats in the water. And so that brings up something that you mentioned before, which is the Biospecimen Network. Again, ask any researcher at a biotech company in the South San Francisco corridor what it's like to get tissue specimens from UCSF. So they call up UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, and say, can we borrow some tissue specimens? We want to do some research and figure out, we want to do some genetic assays on all this stuff. Well, they said, great, but anything you discover, we get a piece of, okay? And, you know, so then the biotech thing, small money with a huge fast burn rate, says, I can't afford that. How do you get enough tissue cultures, tissue specimens, to be able to, and validate them in the same language and do science that's big enough when you're talking about the number of genes that you've got to figure out what their function is, or let alone genes, deal with the proteomic, the proteasome. I mean, talk about a big nut to crack. You need a tremendous amount of biospecimens, and you need a common system for validating them, and you need a common system for access. That seems exciting to young scientists. If I knew I could get that without having to go through the rigmarole of publishing every, year in some obscure journal and working my way up to the big ones, that would make me excited.
because
I might even pass glacial geology.
it's one of these sort of biotech companies that do partner with people. I mean, because we do have all these partners who are the experts in the phenotype and have the samples, et cetera. And the way you cut some of those Gordian knots there is that, well, you share in the success, right? So it doesn't have to be up front, but it can be based on success. And if you're both successful, then that's a good thing. And you can work together. That's how we've done a lot of our collaborations. But I also very much agree that the repositories of these DNA samples where you build cell lines and making that available to all researchers is very useful. And that's been done with a lot of the neuroscience diseases, certainly, like, with Alzheimer's and autism and schizophrenia and bipolar. There's some good, sources there. People are moving more in that direction of creating these sources of DNA samples that then can be used, that are well phenotyped and shared by researchers, which I think is a marvelous tool. And there's a lot of programs of that nature. So I just wanted to add in that piece.
I don't know Andy Grove, but it seems to me you see the value of leadership in this, because the prediction was, again, that all the cancer centers would be enormously resistant to the idea of an information grid. But really all it took was Andy and Ann and others saying, let's do it, and not making it a cost center. It's not like the cancer centers are making a whole lot of money at this, but and everyone is actually enthusiastic. And I think the same could and would be true as we develop these tissue banks, and it just takes somebody actually leading the way here and saying, let's do it, as opposed to, I mean, we've had this discussion about common informatics. This is not the first time this discussion has happened. It happened 5 years ago. I heard it 5 years ago. I was involved in it 10 years ago. This time, it's actually happening. So something's different.
So let me just say one word, though, about what Frank's just said. That is the most rational thing I've heard. And, I was much younger when I started working on this idea of how we can centralize and access and actually annotate and hopefully harmonize all of the biospecimen collections around cancer. And I started that about 2.5 years ago. Actually, my friend Mr. Mittman actually was in some of the first meetings that we held on this. And this is not as straightforward as one would think. And it's really taken about 2 years on this one to decide on the shape of the table. Because if you start thinking about every researcher is driven by the material that they control from whence they derive genetic material. And they value that, treasure that, and know that they're doing it better than anyone else, and that the way they're doing it is the way that it should be done. So this is a conversation that's been going on now for 2.5 years. We finally have real traction on it, finally. But it's all of these issues, I think, to Frank's point, it is an egalitarian approach to science that we have in this country. We don't have a national healthcare system. We don't have a Stalinistic down, sort of top-down approach to things. And we have to build a certain amount of consensus before we can actually move forward. So I think so I'm very encouraged right now, I have to tell you. I mean, I think the community has embraced this idea of bioinformatics and tying themselves together. I think they will embrace and are going to embrace the idea of sharing specimens and creating a national resource. Proteomics, somebody mentioned, is right now is a kind of a Tower of Babel, but it's the most complex and most promising area we have in research today. So the NCI is actually undertaking a national proteomics initiative to provide again, the infrastructure and the reagents and the kinds of things that all investigators need. And last but not least, the NCI is actually undertaking a project with NHGRI to sequence all the genetic defects in cancers. Now, some of us may be dead before that's done, but we're going to start, and I think it will go almost exponentially. I think the technology is going to move fast enough that we can't predict, how fast this is going to ramp up. And I think it's going to be very fast.
We have a little bit of time left for any questions or comments from the audience. Would anybody like to pose anything to our panel? If you could identify yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Maureen Kelly. I'm with Section T, Information Computing and Communications. And you're right that much of what you're talking about here has to do with the information management. I'd like to take the example about the jigsaw puzzle and suggest that one of the problems is that those pieces actually fit in many puzzles and not just a single one. And if you don't have somebody who's sitting outside the particular research at hand, you won't have somebody who's looking for those multiple fits. And there's much that's being done in business in terms of managing information and reusing it that gives us the chance to, gives opportunities to reuse data in interesting ways. And I'd just like to add, it's not HTML, it's XML. HTML is actually part of the problem now.
I would just comment that a later panel today, Carol Kovac will be here from IBM, who is actually, she was with us yesterday at the National Cancer Institute along with several of her colleagues. And actually, I see her standing in the back of the room. But IBM is dealing with several of these kinds of issues along with several other, information management companies that are really picking up the ball and running with it.
Hi, I'm actually a graduate student in infectious disease, but I have a question more at the level of the PI and lower basic research. When in my lab, I'm just starting my PhD and I'm getting into getting funding myself, and we have a collaborative lab. There's 7 PIs in one lab. What changes would you like to see at the level of the PI for better funding and getting money out to where it needs to be and saving some of the individualistic projects that you see?
Well, I'd like to see more. I'd like to see us actually give credit for co-principal investigators on grants. I mean, I'd like to see that change because now it's the individual investigator. That doesn't do us any good in trying to move toward multidisciplinary team science. So I'd like to see co-PIs and co-principal investigators on grants, but I'd also like to see some new mechanisms that really encourage team science. And we have a couple, but I don't think we're nearly where we need to be to actually incorporate real teams into what we're trying to do. We have launched at the NCI a nanotechnology initiative. Why do we do that? Well, one, I think it's a technology that's going to change the way we deliver drugs and actually also diagnose cancer. But more than that, to do nanotechnology, that is the interface of physics, mathematics, biology, and chemistry. So you can't do this unless you have real teams of people who are from disparate kinds of areas. And so we're trying to also move into the areas of science that will encourage this as well as to change the mechanisms. We have to do both, I think.
And I just add, I think it would be nice if, from the NIH's perspective, if in some of these situations they had more flexibility to sort of do sometimes what is right, but sometimes rigid rules prevent that. Mm-hmm. So I think if there's some ways that things could be dubbed more as, guidelines. For example, like on the investigator, the guideline is this, but there's more flexibility. Then you can make the discretionary decision when, look, we all know common sense. The right call here is to do this. Let's just do that, as opposed to having to be stuck. I mean, one of the frustrations I have sometimes when we're working with academic partners and we're submitting for grants is that it's like, well, gee, we can only do so much in any given year because the rules are we can only have so much funding per year. So even though we could do this whole study, have the research done talking about PACE in 1 year, we're going to have to spread this over 4 or 5 years or something and come up with some creative way to do that because that's the only way we can get this grant approved. And those things just frustrate me because it's just delaying the time of when research can get done.
It strikes me that one of the places that the NIH really has an opportunity to do that, also in addition to these new grant mechanisms, which I agree with, is the intramural program. I mean, because there are a group of incredibly smart scientists who are not getting, although they have their own review mechanisms, are not getting R01s in exactly similar way to an extramural. And the entire translational apparatus is there all the way to the clinical center. So there's a real opportunity, and almost an exemplary opportunity within the NIH to do those kind of things.
I agree with that. And we're actually, the new clinical center opened on the NIH campus, and I think it gives us an opportunity to do everything from discovery all the way through translation and clinical research. But the culture of science is the same in terms of us building bridges in the intramural program as well as it is in the extramural program. So we just have a better opportunity to do it a little faster, I think.
Todd Brett-Hauer with the Technical Support Working Group. The discussion here brought up some of the problems with language. In the business world, a portfolio is a collection of activities with a quantitative metric of value associated with the outcome. I would best describe the use of portfolio in existing federally funded science environment as a place where you put like stuff, sort of like a satchel, because we lack a value metric associated with that. Rather than a culture of science, we need to move to a marketplace of science. Across the federal government, it's a $100 billion a year operation, and we have no clue whether or not we are turning a profit. If we were to be managing the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange in the manner in which we monitor and manage federally funded science, the Dow would probably be down around 500 right now, because they are villages. They're little mom and pop operations with no coordination. When was the last time an NCI researcher sat on a National Science Foundation math and computer science review panel? Because at the heart of those advances over the last 10 years have been science and basic chemistry work upon which those NCI researchers stand.
I would actually take some issue with that. And the issue I would take is that the business paradigm has been no better, whatever that be, in terms of delivering the goods for cancer research, than the mom and pop shop at the NIH. And I think it's easy to ding the government because for these sort of outcome variables. But I think, if I look back at particularly at large pharma that has the resources, that has the reorganization, and has the portfolio that you describe, I would argue that the productivity is no better and may even be worse if it could be evaluated.
I'm going to side with Frank here. I mean, as the resident voice of capitalism here, Fortune magazine doesn't get much more than that. I'd say that business does a terrible job. In fact, business does a terrible job at business. If you think about just the various mergers that we've seen, talk about overpaying and under-delivering for things. That's what we do. If business worked, we'd be out of a job at Fortune because most of what we do is chronicle what doesn't work. And I think that if you have it's no harder than looking at the latest conflagrations in big pharma with the Vioxx and the COX-2 inhibitors and whatnot to see that nobody seems to know anything over there anyway. So I don't think, again, the issue is the rules and systems of private enterprise versus public enterprise. I would love to go back to the intramural program of the NCI in the 1970s. There was something magic that was happening then. And I can't, for the life of me, tell the people here, or maybe someone else can, about what was so special about that era, what made things tick. But that's something that was public science, and it worked.
We've got time just for one more comment.
I'm Rainer Glaser. I'm a professor in chemistry, and I would like to connect to one thing that you said, that the most important thing is good people in science. And if you look at the university system as it has developed over the last 15 years, you will notice that all the people who are well-funded, they're basically out of undergraduate education. And all the people that are now doing the undergraduate education are instructors, or very beginning professors, or very old professors. It's not the people that bring the excitement to undergraduate education, okay? And then undergraduate education is probably also getting more difficult because they should study chemistry and physics and astronomy and all that stuff, yes? And I think there's a big chaos in the making because that's not happening at the undergraduate education level right now, and the states are being deprived more and more of funding. So I'm not so sure that we're getting the best people into the science in the next 15 years. And right now we're riding a wave, of investment from a long time ago.
Yes.
So, I think your point is extremely well taken. I was involved in a meeting 2 weeks ago in Houston, and I asked Juan Enriquez to come speak with us. I don't know if you know Juan, but he writes about how genomics and proteomics is not just changing science and medicine, but how it's changing economies and will change economies. But the one thing he pointed out that, where he believes that the U.S. is actually, and the whole of our infrastructure is actually not moving in a good direction. I mean, basically that other countries are actually using what we're doing more effectively than we are. And one of the things they're doing is actually really using sort of the mistakes that we're making in terms of education to sort of buoy up their own education systems. And I mean, something as simple as who heroes are in some of these countries, versus who our heroes are in this country. I mean, he makes some really good points about the fact that we are not potentially doing very much to attract the best and brightest into science. And we better start doing something about that, because that's not just going to affect what we're talking about here today. It's going to affect the economic condition of this country in the future. I agree with you.
Well, panel, I would like to thank you all very much for quite an engaging session. I think we've come quite a long way, both with some forecasts of how we're going to see science conducted over the next several years, as well as some prescriptions for how it might be conducted more effectively. And I'd like to ask all of you to join me in thanking our panel.